Welcome to another Digital Dairy Sunday School. Last week we talked about the culture of tribalism of the nations in the Hebrew Scriptures. And it kind of led us to think about why do we have so many violent stories in the Bible. So we're going to talk about that, what to do with violent stories in the Bible. So let's talk about Lot, and Sodom, Jericho, and every other violent passage in the Hebrew Scriptures, and the New Testament while we're at it. Let's include the stoning commandments, that weird thing in the book of Numbers where a woman has to drink the dust to find out about her pregnancy. And while we're at it, let's include these questions I often hear. Did God really tell the Israelites to kill everybody, including the women and children in those Old Testament stories like in the book of Joshua? Did the prophets hear wrong? Maybe they were putting some well-intentioned projections of their own agendas onto God. Great questions, lots of answers. So first, when you're reading these stories in the Bible, you are reading stories told by people. And people are, well, they're people. And people were, and are, at various stages of consciousness. Think of consciousness like a lens, a filter, a primary way you see and understand the world. What you read in the Bible was mostly told and written by people at a tribal stage of consciousness, as we just discussed. Tribes existed for their own self-preservation. When you went to war with another tribe, it was your God versus their God. If you won, you wiped them out so they wouldn't come back and seek revenge later on. But you already know this because you watched the episode last week. That's just how people saw the world. That's how things worked. That's how they understood their lives. It doesn't matter if it was right or wrong. You have to know that's how they understood the world first. Second, how people interpret events and experiences depends on the stage of consciousness they're at. When you read those stories, then, you are reading an accurate reflection of how people understood their world and the events that transpired in it. Does it surprise you when someone in the Bible wins a battle and then gives their God the credit? That's what people did at the time. Does it surprise you when, after winning, they wiped out the women and the children and then said their God told them to do it? That's what people did at the time. Does it surprise you when they won and then let no one escape but put everyone to the sword and said they did it with God's power? That's what people did at the time. Does it surprise you when Lot says, "Don't rape them, have my daughters"? That's what people did in those situations. Now, you probably find these stories violent and repulsive, primitive and barbaric, because they are, at least according to our worldview. If you didn't find them shocking and awful and confusing, then something is probably wrong with you. And people who read these stories and say, well, that's just how God is, have a very, very warped and dangerous view of God. So all these stories in the Bible, we'll focus here on the Torah, aren't like that. Not all the stories aren't like this. So do you find it primitive and barbaric to care for widows and orphans, as it's commanded in Deuteronomy and throughout the whole of the Scriptures? Do you find it cruel and violent to leave a corner of your field so that the poor could have something to eat, as is commanded in Leviticus? Do you think it's primitive that people should be set free from slavery? Book of Exodus. Well, of course you don't. These ideas, though, were new at the time, and they're found in the Bible. While we're at it, in Ezekiel 16, the prophet quotes God saying, "I will restore the fortunes of Sodom." Apparently, what happened earlier in this story with the cataclysmic destruction of Sodom wasn't the last word about Sodom. More on that later sometime. I think we could do a whole course on Sodom and Gomorrah. We might have weeks of this, so there's all kinds of fun things we can do. Next, here's where things get interesting. What you find in the Bible is stories accurately reflecting the dominant consciousness of the day, and yet, right in amongst, and sometimes even within those very same stories, you find radically new ideas about freedom, equality, justice, compassion, and love. New ideas sit side by side with old ideas. Vicious violence is right there next to new understandings of peace and justice. Awakening consciousness happens from within current consciousness. Seeds are being planted, seeds of a new vision, a new awareness, new possibilities, seeds that are just starting to grow, like the Abram story about a tribe that blesses all the other tribes. It didn't happen overnight. So here's the truth behind that truth. Consciousness does not change overnight. Change takes a while. That's how it's always been. That's how it is with you and me and the church and the country. Change takes time. So let's talk about us. Have you ever had the idea that you should eat healthier? Did you become a raw vegan the next day? Have you ever had the sense that you should exercise more consistently? Did you start competing in triathlons the next day? Have you ever had the conviction that you should do your part to better take care of the environment? Did you reduce your carbon footprint to 0 the next day? Probably not. And if you did, you probably didn't keep it going very long. See, the thing is, you had a new idea, a new vision, a glimpse or a vision of an expanded, enlightened view. Something profound was revealed to you, and it gradually took root. Step by step by step. One new action followed by another, because change takes a while. And that leads me to this. Why do you think we ask these questions about violence in the Bible? Because I hear them all the time. Why are we so offended by what we read there? Why do we find some of these stories repulsive? Why do they cause you to sometimes say, I don't even want to read this Bible anymore. I'm not even sure I want to go to church. Is it because the stories are primitive and barbaric? Yep. But what is it within you that can make that judgment? What is it within you that is disgusted by such violence? Where did you get this idea that there's anything wrong in these stories? Well, you got this idea that there's a better, more civilized way because you do not share that dominant consciousness. Whether it's love or peace or justice or compassion, there is some way, some lens, some filter that you run things through that tells you that killing lots of people is wrong and any God who commands such a thing should be avoided at all costs. Well, how did you get this way? How in the world did the world produce you? Well, humanity has matured, evolved, and grown in consciousness since the time these stories were told. It's often why I notice that younger people are often putting their parents forward in new ideas. Because the children have kind of grown up with them more, and they have to help their parents or sometimes their grandparents come on board. But I see this evolving consciousness in families all the time. So do you see a theme here from these last few weeks? Evolving consciousness. Say it with me, evolving consciousness. It's as present in the Bible as it is in our lives. Just think about the coronavirus and how thinking on it has progressed over the last few months. We didn't all start out wearing masks. A few caught on early, but it took the majority of the culture a while to catch up. And some still don't want to do it. But that's how progress works. It starts with a few catching on early, driving the conversation until more pick up and take up the idea. Throughout this whole pandemic, the understanding of what the virus is, how to mitigate it, all of that has been happening in steps. But as a whole, you're repulsed and offended by certain things in the Bible because you're at a different stage of consciousness than the people who wrote these stories. You don't see the world that way. You think genocide is wrong, and I'm glad you do. You think rape is wrong, at least I hope so. You think putting women and children to death is wrong. Which leads me to this question. How do you explain why we look back on those stories with disgust? What has happened in us that we read those stories the way we do? Is there something at work in human history pulling things forward? Is that something a someone? Your ability to be turned off by these stories is evidence of growth and maturing consciousness. Good job, you. So the thing in these stories that makes you the most ticked off and disillusioned and wondering why we should even be reading these stories is itself a prime example of our capacity to grow and move on and transcend earlier stages of consciousness. Boom goes the dynamite. Because your underlying repulsion with the violent stories in the Old Testament comes from your belief that you're more enlightened than that. Now, have you arrived? Have we arrived as a culture, as a society, as a humanity? Do we have it figured out? Are we perfect? Is there peace on earth? No. Do we have a long way to go? You bet we do. But just the fact that you're repulsed and confused and turned off by these violent stories means that something has been at work within human history moving us forward. And even at the time, the stories at the time that we now think are repulsive and horrible in the Hebrew Scriptures themselves were a big step forward than the things that had been going on, the stories that had been told, the laws that had been passed. For example, an eye for an eye. We see that as kind of barbaric. Like, eye for an eye, the whole world is blind. But at the time, if you took my eye, I took your head. If you hurt my ox, I hurt your child. So an eye for an eye, an ox for an ox was a leveling out. It was a step forward. It took Jesus later to say, okay, we don't need to do an eye for an eye anymore. We can be better than this. So I say to you, turn the other cheek. Jesus is offering all these new understandings of the law, not a brand new law, but another step forward in that law. Think about it this way. When playing soccer as a child, one of the rules we had was you cannot pass it back to the goalie. Now, if you play soccer, or football as it's called in the rest of the world, you know kicking it back to the goalie is an acceptable rule. It is actually a key part of the game often. The goalie just can't pick it up with their hands. The reason we couldn't do this as children was because the coaches in the Rule Society knew one of two things would happen. The goalie would forget and pick it up with their hands, and so we'd have that whole fiasco and the goalie would feel bad, or the kid passing it back wouldn't pass it back well enough and would accidentally score on their own goal. We weren't ready for that rule. Now, in a few years, that rule was added. Doesn't mean it's a whole change in the game. We weren't quite ready for that rule yet. It's like in teaching math. You don't teach children negative numbers from the very beginning. They can barely get the concept of zero, let alone negative numbers. And then once you teach negative numbers, maybe then you'll get into imaginary numbers. But you don't start arithmetic with negative numbers and imaginary numbers. They were always there. You just don't teach it yet. You have to let consciousness evolve. The reality is, none of us have it nailed. None of us understand the world perfectly. No city, no country, no family, no institution, no individuals, no business. We all need help. We all have a long way to go. Our famous Presbyterian phrase is, the church reformed is always reforming. We know we need to keep evolving in our understanding of ourselves, the world, God, our own understanding of grace. We've hardly learned the alphabet of grace, let alone the language of salvation. It's a process. Now, if you read the Bible as a static record about the God who orders people to kill other people, it will never make sense to you. But if you read it as an unfolding story, reflecting growing consciousness about who God is and who we are and what it means to pursue justice and love mercy and walk humbly, as the prophet Micah said, you'll begin to see something at work just below the surface, planting seeds, gradually moving and calling and pulling and tugging and inspiring and transforming. If you read it as the story of humanity waking up, evolving and expanding in consciousness, growing in maturity, becoming more and more enlightened, which was Paul's prayer in the letter to the Ephesians, you may just find a story worth telling and believing. I believe God is the force pulling us forward and helping us evolve. I see it all the time in Scripture, but that also means I don't necessarily put every verse of Scripture on par with every other verse of Scripture. God is pulling us forward, so I have to read the beginning in light of the end and in light of everything else around it. To understand what God is doing in the Bible and with the people of Israel and with us, we have to learn more about people and their God stories. And we'll do that next week.